obligatory few seconds.
Oh, yeah.
Just in case. All right. Dark Bleatings, everyone. We have a podcast today instead of a video because I didn't want to get dressed. And joining me is George Daniel Lea, who's an author, reviewer, runs not one but two YouTube channels, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. There may be more. I don't know. There's a couple out there that haven't done anything for years, so there may be more.
Floating around in the void.
In the void, yeah. These strange non-entities that I probably can't even access anymore.
Yeah.
I can't remember why I set them up.
And I also regard you, George, as a Clive Barker expert and an all-around horror fanatic.
Oh yeah, I mean, like Clive, yes. Clive is my bae. I love Clive to bits. I don't normally get like, I'm normally all about the work as opposed to the creator and whatnot, but Clive is kind of an idol for me. He really is. He's kind of like he has the same status as Bowie or someone like that, Just a mega star. Just a rock star. I think he is for a lot of queer writers, to be honest. Just because he's like the Earth Father. He's the one who blew the gates off for the rest of us and shepherded, he allowed us through into the garden,
Yeah, I was about to actually compare him to a rock star. He's got rock star quality.
He really does. It's annoying, isn't it, actually, sometimes? Because, like, you keep trying to find, like, a flaw in these people. And it's annoying because apparently Clive's a really nice guy as well. And it's like, oh, for fuck's sake.
Oh, of course. Of course he's like, also nice.
Ridiculous, isn't it? It's utterly ridiculous to be that. And when I say he is, like, one of the most talented writers and just general imaginers I've ever come across, that is no word of hyperbole or exaggeration. He is like, he's in a sphere of his own, isn't he?
Oh yeah.
The writing is, I've never come across anyone like him ever. I mean, and now of course, he's been writing since like the 1980s. So there's a lot. He's spawned this entire like tradition of Barkerian writing in the same way that kind of like Lovecraft did at one point. So there are lots of us who, I mean, I'm one of them, there's a lot of us who are kind of like the disciples and children of Clive Barker in that regard. But nobody is like him or even approaches like the level that he operates on.
No, that's true. Everyone knows him. I talked to people who know of Clive Barker because of, film.
Of course, Hellraiser.
Because it's not just adapted work, because Clive writes and directs as well.
And he paints and he does other stuff as well. It's annoying.
Games. My husband recognized the name because of gaming.
Yeah, Undying is one that he did in the late. Was that late? No, that would be early 2000s, I think. Undying, and it's very good. It's annoyingly good.
So
too, he's actually in it too. He actually does one of the voices of one of the. Yeah, he's Ambrose Covenant, one of the villains.
So, contrary to how it might sound, we're not actually talking about Clive Barker today for this podcast.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I will, if he's mentioned, I will railroad any kind of podcast or discussion because it's like,
And that is why I intentionally mentioned it. What?
If you want an icebreaker with me, then mention Clive Barker, and it's like, that swotty kid at school who's like raising, teacher, me, I want to answer. It's that. Sorry.
I'm like that about Stephen King because I'm pretty sure I know everything.
Yeah, I really want to get you and Kit on a podcast discussing something to do with Stephen King because that would be fun.
Oh, you won't get a word in, George, if you put me and Kit on.
I know, that would be fun though. That would be hilarious fun.
Yeah, we are talking about elevated horror today, but just quickly before we actually go into the main topic, George, I have to tell you how much I've been enjoying your Silent Hill 2 remake Let's Play.
Oh, thank you.
It's so entertaining. And guys, if you enjoy Let's Plays or video game commentary and you haven't seen, I'll actually link all of
Thank you.
George's stuff in the description so you can find him everywhere. But
There's
I'm
a
going
lot.
to put the playlist in there as well, the Silent Hill 2 one.
Ongoing. It's not finished yet, but my God, that honestly, I mean, do you know anything about like the history of Silent Hill 2, Kaylee?
Well, I know I'm a big fan of the original game. Being a kid that grew up with, Resident Evil 1, Silent Hill, and
Right.
yeah, that era of gaming. And I've watched so much before this remake was made. There's great video essays and playthroughs on YouTube of the
Right.
original one.
Yeah, dissecting the lore and whatnot, because it just lends itself to that so well, doesn't it? I mean, the symbolism of
Yeah,
the goddamn game. You could write theses on these games. You could like do it as your university dissertation or something.
I almost veered into that until I found out. I watched a YouTube video that was dissecting it and analyzing it, and it was done so comprehensively. I thought, I
Mm.
can't really do a this is a
I,
dissertation.
yeah, yeah, I can't. Yeah, right. There are. I mean,
Oh,
honestly,
yeah.
guys, if you go to YouTube and type in Silent Hill lore or Silent Hill analysis, you will find 4-hour analyses of these games, if not longer, and they warrant that. I mean, I'm
Oh,
just
yeah.
playing the remake of Silent Hill 2 at the moment, and it's very difficult to express while you're in the midst of it because it's so bloody scary.
Scary.
Um, just how deep it goes, just how profound it is, and how that feeds into the horror of it. It just makes for this richer, more profound feeling. I mean, I love Resident Evil to bits. I love it. I'll always love it
Yeah.
because it is like you it kind of came in when I was when I was a teenager and it was new. We'd never really seen anything like it before. It
Hmm.
was so significant. But ultimately, its horror is of a different type, isn't it? It's more of that sort of B movie popcorn horror, that's very
Yeah.
visual. It makes you go, it makes you jump and then it makes you laugh, right? Silent Hill does not make you laugh.
Oh,
It's not
no.
about that. It's this deep, rich, resonant horror that's a bit like, I mean, I hesitate to say it almost, but it's a bit like depression or a kind of it expresses mental illness in many respects. And
Yeah, I
it's it's brilliant in that regard. I mean, for a video game to explore that, but not only to explore it, to evoke the sensation of it.
Oh yeah, it's very well. I actually thought it was appropriate to mention it here because I would consider it elevated horror for sure.
Mhm. Oh
Um,
yeah, I mean, like it's a weird thing, isn't it? Because like, I mean, I don't really the term doesn't really mean a great deal to me. I mean, that's the interesting thing. I remember when my first short story collection came out, Strange Playgrounds, which was about 10 years ago now. Um, There was a review of it, which it was lovely. It was really sweet. It was and it was one of those things where I was very sort of new to all of this. So it was a real boost. It was really nice to have a good review. But it referred to the book as literary horror. And I'd never heard that term before. So I was like,
mhm.
what does that mean? What does that mean? And I looked up and I asked some friends in the writing community what it meant. And I was like, well, that I appreciated the review so much, but that doesn't mean anything to me. I don't really like, especially when I sat down to write, I wasn't thinking in those terms. I didn't
Yeah,
sit down to write like a series of horror stories that were somehow above any other. There's no distinction for me
yeah,
between like the punk and the literary or the yeah, that which is considered to be I hate the distinction. I actually
yeah.
really dislike the distinction.
That
For
well,
me,
that
it's just different flavors of horror that
ex
do different
yeah.
things, that intend to do different things. So, like, I mean, we spoke about it with Resident Evil, right? And
Mhm.
and it's not in any way to denigrate Resident Evil. I just think it's a different flavor of horror. It's trying to do different things. And in
Yeah,
that regard, I think it's really successful. I think it's really successful. Silent Hill 2 is, I mean, mechanically very similar, obviously, based on very similar controls and mechanics, and even the visuals are kind of similar in a way as well. But
hmm, hmm.
the nature, the flavor of the horror is completely different. It's projects. is different. It's trying to do different things to Resident Evil. And I don't think it's like elevated beyond Resident Evil in that regard. I think it's just very, very different. I think it's operating in a different criteria, if you like.
Yeah, I feel the same. Yeah, the first thing I was gonna ask you actually is like what the term means to you and how you think of it. And
It's an
before,
odd one. It's an
yeah,
odd one for me. I honestly, sincerely don't think in those terms. And I often find when I come up against it that it's more of like a thing that's invented for reviewing, or it's almost like it's something or marketing for that.
marketing,
You know,
yeah.
it's a sort of marketing thing. Because for me, I don't draw a distinction. I mean, a lot of the films and the media I love would be considered in those terms would be considered low horror. It would be considered like, much more punky and much more sort of populist. It would occupy a sort of like cult or mainstream bracket, but that doesn't mean that it's any less profound. I mean, I look at
Yeah.
things like, for example, I mean, if you look at like the horror cinema of the 1970s, right, the stuff that's really resonant and profound, stuff
Hmm.
like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, right?
You are reading my mind.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre, yeah.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah.
that is a cult horror film. It's a dirty, grimy, almost grindhouse project that
Hmm.
is it's so grimy and unpleasant, and in many ways very base in terms of its horror.
Hmm.
And yet, it is one of the most culturally resonant, interesting horror films that tells you so much about
Yeah,
what was simmering away in the subconscious of that era, particularly in the US, right?
yeah.
And
It's horrifying.
yeah, it really is. And not just horrifying in terms of what you're seeing or what's actually occurring on the screen, it's what it represents. It's what it
Mhm.
metaphorically represents. Now, nobody would watch the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and say, "Oh, this is like, this is like Melancholia. It's like a Terrence Malick film or like a Lars von Trier film or anything like that." It's not. It's absolutely not. Is it any less smart than those films? No, it is. Yeah, no, it isn't.
Yeah,
It's
I
actually
agree.
incredibly intelligent. It's
I
incredibly
yeah,
smart,
I
and
agree.
it's doing, it's doing stuff that's really deep and resonant. The only difference is it's doing it in a different vein. It's just aesthetically different.
Yeah, the internet. I took to the internet to try and find an official explanation for what the term actually means, and
Yeah, because
the internet.
I still don't really know, if I'm perfectly honest. It's the kind of thing where I'm like, well, where does something stop being one kind of horror and then become elevated horror? At what point does that happen?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I kind of know it when I see it, but it's hard to
Hmm.
describe. The internet says that elevated horror is characterized by a use of dramatic elements and overarching themes rather than gore and slasher scares. And that description to me
Okay.
means kind of nothing because
It means
it
nothing. Yeah, well, because
it's
why
yeah,
can't don't most like bits of media that have the former also have the latter to one degree or another? I mean, you
yeah.
can't even. I mean, look at the basest of the base, the lowest of the low. Look at the original Friday the 13th. Now, that is it's a reactionary piece of schlock, right?
Yeah.
It's totally reactionary. It's when you start to analyze it, its politics is actually quite unpleasant. So, it's all about the hatred of young people. It's about the fear of young people. It's a powerfully pedophobic film. It really is afraid of young people and children and kids. Um, it's about the it's that sort of post 1960s moving into the 1970s paranoia, that generational gap, where
Hmm.
all the ideologies, all the stuff from the 1960s, the counterculture revolution have started to fail. And
Hmm.
as a result, you've got this gap, this generational gap between one set and another. And there's just fear born of that. There's incredible fear born of that separation. Now, that is all encapsulated in that film. It doesn't explore it in the same way that a more consciously academic film would. Like something like, for example, an Ari Aster film would,
Oh
which
yeah,
I also love, by the
yeah.
way. Ari Aster's
We'll go
films,
on to Ari Aster.
yeah,
I
fucking
yeah,
brilliant. I
love
mean,
Ari
just
Aster.
amazing filmmaker. But all of that is still there. all of those things are still encapsulated in the work. Now, how objectionable they might be is up to the viewer, really, but they are there. They're absolutely there, even in that lowest, most base, most blocky form of horror. You have all of these things to explore. You have all of these things expressed about culture. So I don't, again, I'm uncomfortable with the term. I don't
Me too.
really, it makes
Yeah.
me feel a bit, it's the kind of thing where I suspect the reason it exists is, like we said earlier, it's a marketing thing. What it's designed to do is to appeal to people who may have, or to demographics that may have a problem with media that's labeled as horror in
Yeah.
general, you know?
Yeah. I mean, the only kind of horror that's ever going to be considered in award season, for example, is stuff in the elevated horror category, if
Right.
that.
I know.
And I think, yeah, I don't like the term elevated because it does imply that it's sort of intellectually above every
Right.
other genre of
But
horror. And
also
yeah,
the kind of gatekeeping element to it as well, because it suggests that this, oh, this is okay. This is allowed through because
oh
you're
yeah,
allowed to like this because this is elevated. This is art, don't you know? Whereas all that over there is dirty, schlocky nonsense. And it's like, no, 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 no.
well,
Even the dirtiest
yeah,
and the schlockiest of your horror, the most grimy grindhouse stuff has profound resonance and is expressing something about the
yeah,
era in which it was produced. I mean, I look at like the work of Wes Craven, like the early work of Wes Craven. Now, Wes Craven was the Ari Aster of his day. He
oh
was
yeah,
so
yeah,
smart. He was so smart, and the stuff that he's creating, particularly in the 1970s, is expressing so much about being a young, angry counterculture person
hmm
in that era. So you look at stuff like, one of the nastiest, most dirtiest, filthiest films ever made, Last House on the Left.
oh
One of,
yeah,
yeah, right? One of the most horrific, nastiest, exploitative films ever made. That film is a post-Vietnam expression of cultural despair. That's what
hmm
it's about. That's what it's about. And he's actually very conscious of the fact. I mean, there is a within the film, he actually recreates some of the images, the news images, the news footage and photographs that were coming out of Vietnam at the time of very real atrocities that were being committed. It's
yeah,
really clever in that regard. It's really clever, and it's angry and it's violent, but it's expressing those feelings within American culture at the time, particularly amongst young people, amongst artists, amongst people who are sort of like counterculture anyway.
hmm
I get the
yeah,
impression people who like, who kind of use the term elevated horror and who, we watch elevated horror, don't you know? They would dismiss something like Last House on the Left. They would dismiss something like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. They would dismiss something like The Shining, not The Shining, maybe because that's cheaper, but something like Poltergeist, maybe,
hmm
because it's too popular and it's too popcorn. No, it's a bit mainstream, don't you know, love?
yeah.
Again,
I
Poltergeist, right? Poltergeist is a Steven Spielberg film. It's really like it's regarded as a popcorn horror film. Yeah.
mhm.
It's this great, brilliant ghost train ride of a film with special effects all over the place. And on a purely aesthetic level, you really fun, really brilliant fun film. But underneath it, there's so much going on. There's so much going on. It's an anti-capitalist, anti-neoliberal narrative. Cuesta
Yeah.
Verde, where it's set, is a corporately made town. It's a town that exists because a corporation needs it to exist for its workers. And that is the source of the horror. That is the source
Yeah.
of the horror.
There's a I've seen very few horror films where there's nothing going on. Like I think that the
Yeah.
kinds of people that refer to horror with like, oh, I don't like horror, I don't like all blood and guts and stuff, and
Mm.
it's a
Well,
really inaccurate, dismissive way of describing
yeah.
horror because that's people I don't know, I always get people, oh, I don't like horror, I'm not really into like slashers and stuff, and I'm like, well, the slasher
Oh,
subgenre isn't for me either, but that's not
right.
all horror is.
No, it isn't.
Like
And I mean, even that, right? Even that, what does that mean? What are you talking about when you say a slasher film? Are you talking
Exactly.
about Psycho, like Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho? Because I imagine because of the pedigree of Hitchcock, that would be allowed through the gates now, right?
Yeah, I think so. And more recently, I am. It took quite a lot of time for people to realize that Scream was satire.
Right,
Um,
right.
and
And you
that's
watch it
one of
now
the
and you think, well,
yeah.
how can you not? How can
Yeah,
you not understand that? And
I
it is
think
because of context, isn't it? It's because of
I
context, right?
yeah,
So
I think it's because
horror
it was such a
fans,
yeah, it was such a competently made slasher film that
right.
people didn't realize.
It is
Uh,
really beautiful, isn't it? It's really beautiful. It's elegant. So horror
yeah,
fans, people who know about slasher films up to that point, say up to the mid 1990s, come at it and they see this really clever, really aware film that is it expresses all of the tropes of that subgenre and then it pastiches them in a really beautiful way to analyze itself. It's really, really clever. People
it's
who
so
don't
funny
know this
because of
stuff.
it as well.
Say again.
It's just so funny because of it as
Oh,
well, because it's all the stuff
right.
that we love about slasher films.
Yeah, it's
Um,
hilarious. Scream is freaking hilarious. It's a
yeah,
really, really funny film.
yeah, it's
But
great.
it's especially funny, I think, if you are a fan, if you are a horror fan. If you're not, you people tend to come at it as a horror film, and that is the genius of it. That is the absolute genius of it. It operates on these multiple levels. And I mean, post Scream, obviously, it became really difficult to do a slasher film.
It was so funny to me when Scary Movie came out because it's like, oh, it's a parody of Scream,
Right.
Scary Movie, and I was like, but Scream
Scream's
was
a
a
parody.
satire.
Yeah, yeah.
So
So I
funny.
mean,
Well,
I mean, it's a good shout actually, Scary Movie, because Scary Movie is demonstrative of how little culture understood Scream. You know,
yeah,
you
yeah,
can't
still funny
satirize a
though.
satire. Doesn't work. You can't satirize a satire.
I think what you just said about the context is important. I went to see the Evil Dead remake on a
Mm,
date years when it went 2013 was it when it came out,
think
and
so.
somewhere around there. And this guy had never seen any Evil Dead before, so he had no background knowledge of the franchise. And then I'm a big Evil Dead fan,
Mhm,
and I thought the Evil Dead remake was firstly, it was one of the few good
yeah,
remakes or like returns. Secondly,
definitely.
it was a great homage to like what it's based on,
Mhm,
and like what it's remaking. And I thought it was really funny,
yep.
because like there's like that one guy that just keeps getting stabbed.
Oh, there
It's
was a
just
bit, and really early on, I realized when I felt like I was in safe hands with this remake, and it's a bit really early on before anything is kicked off. When they get to the cabin, and somebody, and I can't even remember why it happens, but somebody picks up an electric carving knife in the kitchen and places it, and it's right in front of the camera. And it's almost like the film is saying, yeah, yeah, you know what's going to go down. And I
this
thought
is
that's
it.
brilliant.
Yeah.
That's
It's
brilliant. This film, it's inviting you in. It's
yeah,
saying to you, you know what's going to go down. Look, this stuff is going to happen with this. So just sit back and let us do it. Yeah, and I
yeah,
loved that. I thought
great.
that was really nice. I thought that was kind of like it was almost oddly for it was an odd sort of like warm thing, an inviting thing for the film to do.
It was yeah, it was very I feel like I caught a lot of like in jokes because of being
Mhm.
familiar with the originals, like little
Yeah.
little nods too. And but the guy that I was on the date with was I looked over at him at one point. I was cackling away like a little witch there, and he was like, "This is shit," and I was like,
Oh
"Oh,
no.
oh my God." And I just thought, well, maybe there is something to like I don't think you have I think maybe it just wasn't his cup of tea at all, but I
Yeah,
did
yeah.
wonder if there was something to this is more appealing. I know that they remake things to bring them to new generations and blah blah
Mhm.
blah. So I don't think you have to be familiar with the old ones to enjoy the new ones at all. But
No.
I did wonder if the very extreme difference of opinion that he and I had was because he just had no background love or
Right.
knowledge of them. So I did wonder how much that played into him just like and he was like, "Why are you laughing?" And I was like, "Oh, okay." So he wasn't understanding he didn't really get the tone of it, I don't think.
Right, right. And yeah, and I understand that actually. I mean, it's very difficult when you've grown up, because I grew up with the Evil Dead too. I've
Mhm.
always loved those films. So it's very difficult to divorce yourself from those contexts when you have them, isn't it? It's very, very difficult. But trying
Yeah.
to look at it, I mean, it is an extreme film as well. There's a lot of really very visual, like as there is in the original films, there's loads of really visual gore and like mutilation and stuff like that. But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
like you, I thought it was hilarious.
I did
Like
you I
absolutely hilarious.
when it started raining, I was dead. I couldn't
Yeah.
stop laughing because obviously I think another part of like the it's like a tongue-in-cheek joke again towards the original because it's known for being so gory, the original. And
Right.
I just thought the second it started raining blood, I was like, I wanted to applaud it. I was like, this is so
Uh-huh.
funny that they were like, right, we have to up the ante a little bit. What do
Uh-huh.
we do? We'll just
They
cover
did.
everyone.
Yeah, let's just drench the whole screen in blood. Like the whole set, every character, everything. There's going to be blood everywhere.
It
And there's going
was,
to be people
yeah.
missing limbs, and there's going to be people like bisecting their own tongues. And it's just going to be like, and we're going to put it all in front of the camera, just like the original Evil Dead. Because, like, Sam Raimi's whole thing was the audience must suffer, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, but no, I mean that's another good one actually. That's another good shout. This really does expose like the odd fluidity and the inconsistency of these divisions and these structures that people come up with from time to time. So The
Yeah.
Evil Dead would have been originally considered a really schlocky student horror film that's all about the gore and
Mhm.
the visuals and whatnot. But again, these days, because of the pedigree of the film, that would probably be allowed through the gates. That's the kind of horror film now, because it is enshrined, would be allowed through despite the fact that it has all of the qualities of a down and dirty, schlocky, punky horror. You know?
Yeah, the two don't have to be, mutually exclusive.
Right. Yes.
Something can be clever and insightful and thought-provoking and bloody, or it can be, use a little bit of both. I think that most good films are intelligent. Like you don't
Yeah.
enjoy things unless people who care about what they're doing have made them, generally speaking.
Absolutely, absolutely. But it's a different kind of intelligence, isn't it? So a film can be really dumb and be
Oh yeah.
really good fun, be
Well,
really well made, as long as it's doing what it's attempting well, and there's passion and there's like sincerity involved, then
yeah.
great, right?
I
Great. That's wonderful.
I think a perfect example of a film that on the surface looks and sounds like it would be done, but actually is one of the tightest scripts you'll ever find is Shaun of the Dead.
Shaun of the Dead, right? Shaun of the Dead is a
As
really,
it
I mean,
was.
and also a beautiful film. Like on a technical level, in terms of
Yeah,
just like the cinematography and the direction and the framing, it is an astonishingly brilliantly done film.
it's
Uh,
brilliant. Yeah, the more times you watch that, the more jokes you pick up
yeah,
because
absolutely.
there's no single wasted word or shot in that film, and it actually makes me angry. I think I saw a behind the scenes thing with Simon Pegg and Edgar Wright where they just went to a cabin for a week to write it,
Yeah,
and I was like, a week?
yeah,
Are
right.
you kidding?
It's annoying, isn't it? That is actually really quite annoying. And to come out with something, a film that is in many respects a turning point as well, which is it's so iconic that it spawned its own kind of little subgenre of horror comedy.
Yeah,
Absolutely brilliant. I mean,
yeah,
absolutely brilliant. And again, yeah, you are right because like in terms of its themes and whatnot, it's not trying to do anything that profound. It really isn't. It's a very sort of surface level film, but that doesn't matter because it's
yeah.
really well done. It's
It's
entertaining and it's really well done. I mean, on the other hand, you have films that are like that are may even be in many respects are not that well made, but which
yeah.
express something either accidentally or intentionally. So we did we're doing our sort of like we're doing our Halloween season over on Exaggerated Elegy at the moment, a bit later than usual because of you know schedule conflicts and whatnot. And we're doing folk horror. We're doing like a folk horror season. We've already done Midsummer, and the
Woohoo.
second film we did was Blood on Satan's Claw, the
Oh yeah,
1970s film.
yeah.
And that film on the face of it, is an absolute mess. It
Hmm.
was originally a triptych, so it was meant to be like three little stories loosely linked together, but they had the bright idea of collapsing them all together into one, which simultaneously doesn't work. What it does is that it lends the whole film this weird, incoherent, almost nightmare quality that I think actually accidentally makes it much stronger. It makes the impression of it much stronger. But
Yeah.
even given the many, and it has many faults, by the way, this film is, its politics is really reactionary. It's all about the again, it's this sort of post 1960s thing where there is this rupture in society where all of the great sort of counterculture projects have completely failed. Hippiedom is dying on its backside, and we're starting to build towards the beginnings of neoliberalism, which will take over completely in the 1980s. That's what this is expressing.
Yeah.
And it does so in a very reactionary way. So it's about the fear of the young, it's about the fear of women, and it actually plays into those fears. It seems to express those fears as a project. I mean, there's this whole subplot in the film where there's like, it's like a little village in the very early 18th century, and some creature, some entity is unearthed from beneath the ground, which claims to be a biblical demon, and it starts to take over the young of the village, and they start to engage in like satanic rites and bacchanals and all sorts of nonsense like that. So you can see how it's about those early counterculture revolutions, right? It demonizes things like sexual freedom, and women are very prominent in that little sort of cultish movement. So again, it's this whole thing about fearing women. And at the end of the film, like the guy who saves the day is this town elder, this judge, who is incredibly patriarchal and authoritarian and aggressive. So it's about, like, you know, obeying your elders and being very conservative and very conformist. And on that level, the politics is absolutely objectionable. It's completely reactionary. However, even given that, even given that, the film is interesting and clever enough that, and not even intentionally, it's just resonant enough of what is happening at that time in the
Yeah.
culture of its production. Yeah. So you can even come across films that are not only kind of badly made, which it sort of is in many respects, not only kind of objectionable in many, in certain ways, and very overtly so, but still are profoundly resonant and kind of interesting and insightful in their own ways.
Yeah, I can't agree more. I used to write a series for Gingernuts of Horror called Challenge Kaylee, where
Oh, right. Okay.
for anyone who hasn't heard of it, so what I did was I made the proud, boastful claim that I love horror so much
Uh-huh.
that there is no single horror film that I can't find genuine merit in. So the
Okay.
challenge was people would send me film suggestions for things that they wanted me to review. And
Oh,
if I couldn't be positive, genuinely, sincerely positive about it, then they won a prize and I was defeated.
okay.
And I'll
I
tell.
I I might have one for you. I would posit the Poltergeist remake, the 2015
Okay.
Poltergeist remake.
Well,
There is nothing good about that film. Like,
well,
nothing.
I'm gonna have to. I challenge accepted. I don't like the series anymore, but I'll maybe I did talk to Jim a couple of years back about maybe reviving it, and then I got really
Oh,
into it and
brilliant.
stuff. So maybe
Of
I'll
course.
speak to him again. But it was quite popular article series, and what I
Yeah, I'll bet. Great
what
dynamic. Really good dynamic.
I'll tell you who beat me. I made it 12 films before someone
Hmm.
beat me, and it'll probably make you laugh. Um, but what I learned was when I sat
Uh,
down, I was genuinely trying to find the merit in these films. I did.
yeah.
So the films that people sent me were Troll 2.
Oh my God. You know what? No, I mean, Troll 2's funny.
It's
That's the
hilarious.
thing.
That
That's
was
the thing.
easy.
That's a laudable quality, isn't it? That's easy. Troll 2 is hilarious.
Yeah, and the one that I actually really enjoyed writing about was Zombie Lake, where everyone seems to regard that as absolute trash. And it
Uh-huh.
is in many ways, but
Yeah.
I did a little bit of research on the director and
Uh,
discovered that the director worked in porn first, directing porn
Interesting.
films. And so when I knew that, when I watched this film, I noticed how much commentary there is on the male gaze in how the female characters are
Oh,
presented. and I was like, no, there is genuine
Stuff, right?
commentary here.
Yeah,
Like,
like conscious or otherwise, yeah. That there is stuff going on here. Like we said earlier, it doesn't have to be an Ari Aster project. And that again, by the way, that's no shade on Ari Aster. Those films are remarkable. They're
wonderful, yeah.
absolutely remarkable, very sincere. Um, but are they any more profound or insightful than other films which would not be regarded as in the same bracket? Well, not always, no.
It's subjective, is it? It depends on your
Exactly.
taste, what
Well,
resonates with you.
actually, I mean, Midsummer is a really good example, actually, because that is one of the films for which there are so many bad takes out there. I've
Mhm.
seen people we did Midsummer for our folk horror season, and one of the things we spoke about is how poorly this film is actually interpreted across the board and from multiple different political and ideological biases as well.
Mhm.
So there are people who are from a more sort of right-wing conservative perspective who regard it as this bizarre assault upon sort of Western history and civilization. They think that it's an attack upon moral, like very conservative moral values, and that's really interesting because they're wrong.
That's
But
that's
all
what made
right.
making me wonder what
But
conservative values actually are.
Well,
If
what they seem to misinterpret, they make the same fundamental misinterpretation that people from the more left-wing and progressive perspectives do in a
Mm,
different way. So they seem to regard the Haga, the civil, the little the commune
yeah.
that's central to. They seem to think that the film is presenting that as though it's desirable, and doesn't.
Oh,
Not
yeah,
ever. Not in any way, shape, or form does it present that society as though it's desirable. It is
yeah,
drawing a comparison between two different cultural archetypes. That's absolutely true. But what it
yeah,
isn't doing is drawing a binary judgment. It isn't saying one is better than the other. Its actual commentary is much more despairing and nihilistic than that. What it's actually saying is there is not such a thing as a perfect or as a utopian society. There is sickness, there is evil and wickedness innate to our traditions in the
yeah,
same way there is innate to us, to humanity. So whatever frame in which we operate, we have these issues cropping up again and again and again and again. Now,
yeah.
from the perspective where I would be more at home, where I would generally regard those who occupy it as my ideological allies on the left, right?
Mhm.
Like I found when I was doing my research for the film, I found these writings from feminist writers who seemed to believe that the film was presenting the Haga as though it was some sort of like hyper feminist empowerment parable. And I'm like, well, are we watching the same film? Women are reduced to symbols in this
Yeah, it-
society,
yeah,
and their roles are entirely prescribed. This is not in any way a it's a feminist text. That's absolutely true, but not in that way. It's not a text about empowerment. It's
yeah.
feminist in the sense that it's commenting on the way these highly prescriptive, high control, authoritarian cultures and ideologies kind of spiritually mutilate women and men as well, by the way, to fit into certain symbolic roles. That's the commentary.
Yeah, I'm so happy that we just sort of naturally got onto this because it was listening to you talk about Midsummer that made me ask you if you wanted to do this podcast because
Right.
I saw so many people there's like people are now saying there's a genre of horror and it's the good for her category and they keep
Oh,
putting Midsummer in it.
I'm
And
like,
I'm like,
what? Are you watching the
oh,
same film?
I was
Are
like,
we watching the same film? This is not about female empowerment. It is exactly the opposite. By the end, Danny, the central character, is hollowed out. She isn't
yes.
empowered.
And
She's been completely, every element of her identity has been broken down and ripped out of her and filled with the symbolism that's prescribed for her by this culture.
Yeah, she's been completely indoctrinated, and I think that she was intentionally targeted as well. I don't think she accidentally ended up there.
Not a
Um,
chance. No, I mean, you look at certain things that happen in the film. So you know when she wins the dancing competition,
yeah,
that's not a mistake. That's not an accident. That had to happen. That
the
is completely planned. It's completely prescribed. It's like the Wicker Man, which it emulates. Obviously, it's like a
yeah,
it is a very much a modern day take on the central premise of the Wicker Man. Just as every step of Sergeant Howie's progress through Summerisle is orchestrated by the people there, so
yeah.
too is Danny's through the Haga.
There's a theory that I don't know if I agree or disagree with it. That that Pele was something to do like with the opening scene with her parents, and I'm not sure about that, but I do think that Pele was only friends with her boyfriend to get her to
Oh
his
yeah,
town,
yeah.
because it's just so obvious, and I also think, and I might be reaching on this a little bit, but because of the set design, the costume design, and
Mhm.
everything, it's so interesting. I've watched it so many times, and I've watched all of the behind the scenes stuff I can
Yeah.
find, and I did notice. In one of my multiple viewings, I realized that the actual festival they're celebrating isn't over at the end of the film. They're still midway through it, and also those all the photos of the previous May Queens. I was like, where are
Uh,
they?
where are they? Right. What has to happen to the May Queen? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like,
I imagine she ends up in the soil at some point, in some way, shape, or form. Yeah.
yeah, I was
That's
thinking,
what I'm thinking.
yeah, I was like, what happened to the May Queens then? Because they haven't
Exactly. Why do
really,
you need a right? Why do you need a new one every year? And where are the old ones? I
and
think I think you've got a Sergeant Howie situation. They're going to
yes,
end up sacrificed, you know.
and I did notice that everyone that is selected and everyone considers it an honor, they're all dying.
Yeah, right.
So I thought, well, why would the May Queen be any different?
Why
That's the
would
ultimate, like,
right? And I mean, that's one of the most interesting things about the film for me. It's the way it presents death in this culture. Because
yes,
another thing people really get wrong, or another thing they really misinterpret, is that they seem to say things like, "Oh well, I mean, the way they treat their old people, that makes a kind of sense." No, it really doesn't. It's an awful, awful thing because
hmm
these people don't really have agency. That's the truth of the matter. These people, just like Danny at the end, are
oh gosh,
hollowed out of their identities. They don't
yeah.
have any identity or any free will or volition anymore.
And she has been sort of like fully turned, I feel, because I did notice as well. This is just me with my nerd hat on, on in my film, like back in my film analysis brain. But I noticed that in pretty much all of the scenes where like after where Danny's so after she's chosen to be the May Queen, um, the flowers and all of the scenery and everything is always like moving a little bit because they're all high. And then
Yeah,
I
yeah.
I noticed that right at the end, when she picks Christian to be one of the sacrifices, nothing's moving. So I
Right.
felt like, oh,
Right.
she's sober now, and like that's how I read it anyway. I
Interesting.
I thought I was like, I think that that's why the inclusion of all of the little pulsing flowers was in there,
Mhm.
because you don't do that accidentally. They
No,
needed
right, as
page
a
people to do
little
that.
right. So it's like a little visual shorthand, right? It's a way
Yeah.
of telling you what frame of mind Danny is actually in. I think you're right. I think you're right. By the end, she is everything's been taken from her. She's
Mhm.
already, and that's why she's perfect for this condition. That's why she is sought out and drawn into the Haga because
Yeah.
her circumstances make her perfect. They make
Yeah.
her perfect because she's already been traumatized by everything that happens early on. Which, by the way, is another commentary. I love
Oh
the
gosh.
the
Yeah.
visual distinction between the opening segment and then when you get to the Haga. So things like, for example, the framing, the lighting, and the camera movements are different,
Oh yeah.
completely different,
Yeah.
to show you that these are two almost distinct worlds in many respects. And yet, when you really start to think deeply about it, they are also the same. They are also
Yeah.
the same. So early on, everything is shot within these very claustrophobic rooms, everything's shot through windows. sometimes in reflection. So you don't even get like
Yeah.
a proper view of the real person. Everything's very claustrophobic and closed off, and people are always talking past one another. People don't understand how to
Yeah.
communicate. We are living in this sort of atomized, postmodern, neoliberal society where we can't form proper relationships. So you've got
Mhm.
Danny, who is separate from her boyfriend, who doesn't want to be her boyfriend, by the way. And neither of them know why they're in that relationship anymore, but they can't just say to one another, these are the problems I'm having. She lies to him because she's afraid that he's going to leave. He lies to her because he's afraid of hurting her. And they do it over the phone. Even her sister, who is mentally unwell, which is very clearly established,
Yeah.
Danny isn't there with her. They're
Hmm.
talking over email. So she doesn't know how to interpret what's going on. You know?
Yeah.
It's so interesting, and yet, when I mean, the sort of really clever trick that the film pulls is when you first get to the Haga, because of the way it's presented with all the sunlight and the color and the plastered on
Mhm.
smiles, you are led to believe or to think that this is a better society. This is a society where people are together, where they have roles, where they have poetry, where they have purpose. But the
Mhm.
point is, these people are as atomized and as separate as anyone who appears in the previous situation because they're not together. They're
Yeah.
not communicating with one another. They're
And they, yeah.
communicating on the basis of the symbolism, what the mythology requires of them. There's no sincerity or real communication or even real desire or identity here.
Yeah, there's a lot of social obligation. The red-haired girl whose name I don't remember, but the one
Yeah,
who like
yeah,
yeah, the one that ends up with a Christian.
yeah.
The scene before she goes out and she's like hyping
Yes.
herself up to go
Right.
out to join and then she goes out with a beaming smile and I was like, holy
But
crap.
that is I think that is one of the key scenes in the film. I really, really do. Because I
Mhm.
mean it's so short, it's blink and you'll miss it, and you may not even realize like what you're looking at there.
Which
But the
character it
fact,
is. Yeah.
right. But the fact that in this rare private moment for a young woman in this society, by the way, she
Hmm.
has to do this. She has to put on the mask. She has to put away her identity and
Yeah.
psych herself up to go out with the big plastered on smile and fulfill her role. That's
Yeah.
what everyone in this culture has to do, regardless of how terrible it is. You know, some of them commit ritual suicide, a lot of them commit ritual murder and mutilation. They just have to do it because that's their role.
Hmm. Yeah, what I found really interesting about Midsummer, like the more you look online about like how people are responding to it and everything,
Mhm.
the more I felt like the film is like kind of indoctrinating the audience because
Mhm.
the number of people who were like, "Yeah, good for her, fuck you,
Right.
Christian," at the end, and I was like, that is such a disproportionate
Right.
ending for him for his apparent crimes because he is a
Right.
douche. Like he's he is kind of being selfish in not
Mm.
just breaking up with her because
Right.
he doesn't I think he doesn't want to deal with feeling guilty.
Right. Yeah,
And it's
absolutely.
not doing her any favors. And you see him being a bit of a dick where he's like, I'm just going to slip up to this party. And he's just trying to get away
Mm.
from her. But
Yep.
he is also a guy that doesn't want to be with her. And then she suffers this horrible tragedy. So, of course, he
Right.
can't leave her now. And I think everybody would understand that.
Well,
But because, yeah.
one of the other things about that relationship is that it's not, and this is something that people have real problems with. It's not binary. It's not a case of he's the bad guy and she's the good guy. It's
Hmm.
actually a case where they are both victims of the culture in which they're occurring, so they don't know how to communicate properly with one another.
Yeah.
And also, they're both kind of mutually abusive as well, not in the same way or to the same degrees, but the fact that Danny kind of manipulates him into staying in a relationship that she knows he doesn't want to be in. That's kind of abusive too. Okay, he's also a dick. You know, there's no doubt about that. And it's very difficult because it's not out of malice, it's out of desperation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because she is a little bit manipulative, like because she's afraid of like I feel like all of her interactions with him are a bit calculated. She's watching
Yep,
herself to make sure she doesn't piss him off and things.
exactly.
Um, But I did think, well, he's kind, he's a bit, he's kind of a dick. Like they're a few years in, he forgets her
Hmm.
birthday. But
Yeah,
but then I thought but we're seeing this through Danny's lens, whereas if this
right.
film was from Christian's perspective, he's a guy who kind of like wants to break up with his girlfriend, but then her whole family die. So of
Right.
course he can't do it. And then she tags, like he invites her, but he kind of he feels like he
Yeah,
has to invite her on the trip because otherwise he's abandoning her, and he's hoping
yeah.
she won't come, and then she does go.
Hmm.
Even though she's not a student, she doesn't have any
Yeah.
interest in this stuff.
Right, even though she doesn't want to go, right? The only reason she's going is to sort of keep tabs on him,
Because
and to make,
she's afraid, yeah, I think she's afraid of the separation, and if he might
exactly.
reconsider the relationship while he's away if she's not there. And then um and then while they're there, she's it's all about her while they're there, clearly, because the Haga have picked her.
Right. Yeah,
Um
exactly.
and then he gets drugged and assaulted.
Yes, he does. And I mean that assault scene is really interesting because
It's oh God,
everyone is a victim there. Everyone is a victim. The
it's
young girl,
awful.
she's
Oh,
clearly being led to believe this is something celebratory and wonderful. And when you look at her and the sound she's making, it's clearly awful, right? It's clearly a terrible experience.
and
I
the
That detail of the way the women gathered emulate her sounds,
yeah,
emulate her expressions. What they're doing there is taking away her agency. They're taking away her emotion. They're not engaging in a sort of act of sisterly togetherness or empathy there. They're actually
right.
taking it away from her and saying, you can't have this. You actually can't have this emotion. They do it to Danny a little later,
Yeah,
you know?
it's not a show of empathy and sisterhood at all. It's you're not an individual,
Right. I
and
mean,
this is what we're doing. Yeah,
that
that's
is exactly it. It's a way of saying, in a really weird way, it's a way of saying shut up and just get on with it.
I,
That's the
yeah,
subtext. You are not allowed to have this emotion. You are not allowed to have this reaction. It is inconvenient. It is against the plan, the design, the
yeah.
faith, you know?
Yeah, we've all got to be happy about all of this. And the other thing I thought about, if it was from Christian's perspective that we saw the whole story, so that like, and the number of people are like, oh well, he cheats on her. I'm like, well, not. I mean,
He
if
was
this was the
I
other
mean,
way, if they reversed the gender
yes,
roles on this, there's no way anyone would say that.
right.
And he does turn to leave, but
Mm.
there are two guys stopping
Yeah,
him, like.
also, he's drugged and he's in an altered state of mind and he's kind of coerced. It is an assault scene. Let's not
And they
forget this.
and it's pre-planned. Like the
Right.
reason that they've drugged everyone is to coerce them.
Hmm.
And immediately after, he's so freaked out,
Yeah.
right, like he doesn't know what's going on. And then his girlfriend, his last tether, and
Hmm.
from his perspective, someone that he thinks he has supported, he has stayed with her, she
Right.
chooses him to burn to death.
Chooses him to burn to death. Yeah, which is, I
Oh
mean,
my God.
their problems are domestic ultimately,
Yeah,
they're problems that should be sorted out with, little arguments and discussions. They're
yeah,
not problems that you sort out with burning to death, you know? It's an
yeah.
extreme, I mean, that's one of the many reasons why I neither agree with nor particularly understand the reading of this film, that it is a parable of feminist empowerment. It is not. In the same way, by the way, that Ari Aster's previous film, The Witch, isn't. People read
Oh,
that in the same way too. At the
well,
end
that's
when
Robert
the
Eggers, The Witch.
oh, Robert Eggers, yes, sorry.
Yeah,
Yes, you're
that. Yeah,
absolutely right.
I feel
But
the
people
same.
read that in the same way. When I can't remember her name, but the daughter, the eldest daughter at the end,
Oh,
basically
Thomason.
becomes a witch. Thomason, that's right,
Thomason.
Thomason.
Yeah.
She is seduced by Lucifer, by the devil, and she becomes a witch at the end. And again, people have read that as a sort of like, well, she exists in this patriarchal Puritan society, and this is her escape and her empowerment. And it's like, no, 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 no. You're misreading this. She
Yeah.
has lost everything, and she has been coerced by a powerfully phallic male force into signing a contract in which she becomes his slave. It is
Correct.
not empowerment. It
Yeah.
is the opposite. It
Yeah.
is the opposite. She's just swapped one system of patriarchal enslavement for another.
Yeah, after being left completely alone, her
Right.
whole family's
With
gone.
no choice. No
Yeah.
choice in the matter because, I mean, even when she had a family, the whole situation was dire anyway, wasn't it? They had no hope
Mhm.
whatsoever. And, it is one of those, I think the big problem is people have this problem with with complexity, with things that are not binary. So it has to be good and bad. It has to be black and white. It has to be this is
Mhm.
desirable. This is not. It is, and many times, these works are not saying that. They're much more ambiguous. What they're doing, and particularly this is particularly true of the films of Ari Aster and Robert Eggers and whatnot. They are giving you the situation, and they are using it as these sort of like playgrounds for mucking about with the ideas, for
Yeah.
exploring them, for dissecting them. They are not very often coming down on a side. It is not like a political statement. Politics is
Mhm.
there, but it's not a statement of taking a side very often.
Mhm.
It's expressing things. It's expressing things in a much more subtle and ambiguous manner than that. I mean, unambiguously, Midsummer, The Witch, they are about patriarchy. I mean, like unambiguously.
Mhm.
I would say, like very, very powerfully, they are about patriarchy. But they are often misread in how they are commenting upon that, how they are dissecting that, and indeed how they are criticizing that. The Haga is not some like utopia of feminist empowerment. It is exactly the opposite.
It's
Women are
yeah.
reduced there. They are prescribed to, and that's it. Then and also their agency is taken away. They're hollowed out and made into walking symbols of the feminine, of
Yeah.
the traditionally female.
Yeah. Gosh, there are so many films where my favorite thing to do when I've watched, I suppose, elevated horror for me is just anything that's got massive rewatch value, where
Mhm.
I see new things every time, and
Right, right.
I guess that's what I would, for me personally, that's how I would class it, and also things that generate a lot of conversation about how people have read the thing. And one of my favorite films for commentary from other people where I've seen so many different opinions was The Menu. Have you seen that?
I've seen the menu. Yeah, I liked the menu a lot. I haven't seen it
I
for a long while, but yeah, it was a bit of a shocker actually. I don't
Yeah.
know why, but I came to it with a certain set of expectations that it flouted completely. It was darker than I thought it was going to be. It
Hmm.
was more horrific than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
And the commentary was really interesting. Again, another film whose politics is really actually quite complex.
It was, I think I said this to you before. I told my husband's not much of a horror film fan, so I tend to just
Mhm.
tell him about horror films I've watched,
Yeah.
whether he wants to know or not. And God bless him. So I told him about The Menu, and I said, oh, it's really funny. It's very humorous, but it's about these people that go to this really exclusive restaurant on an island, and it's like the kind of joke that's running right on the surface there is that it's really pretentious, and it's
Yeah.
like arty, kind of inedible food, and everyone's commenting and blah blah blah, and whatever. So I was telling him all about it, and he was like, "Huh." And I was like, "On the joke is that everyone's just sort of like eating it up," and he was like, "Is that the joke? Because I feel like you've just had the piss taken out of you." And I was like, "What do you mean?" And he went, "Yeah," but he was like, "You're watching what sounds like a sort of liberal film about the class divide and like etc. But this is a film made in Hollywood, starring A-list actors that probably cost millions to make, and you're just sat there eating up the liberal message." And I was like, "Oh my God!" And he hasn't even watched it, and I was like, "There is an element
Yeah, and I do kind of think that film is kind of aware that
yeah,
that's what it's doing.
yeah,
It feels like it is, doesn't it? It really feels like it's aware of that, and
yeah."
is a commentary upon that very fact about that whole sort of bougie, society and culture where people do things in a purely aesthetic way. They pretend to enjoy things. They only do things because of the appearance of them. That's very
Yeah.
Hollywood. That's very Hollywood, isn't it? You know?
Yeah, it's just very entertaining as well, though. I think Anya Taylor-Joy is great.
Oh, I mean, it's so. I mean, what got me about it was how intense it often was, like how emotionally intense it was.
Mhm.
It was more than I expected. I don't know. I expected it to be lighter than it
Yeah,
actually was, and I was pleasantly surprised about the depth of it and the emotion on display.
yeah. There's some similar things to Midsummer about that for me, in that I got sometimes I wonder about if I'm okay because of the things I laugh at in these films. But the ending, where obviously she figures out how to get out of there, but
Uh-huh.
then when she looks back and the rest of them are all looking at her,
Yeah.
I mean, they could probably still at that point rush the doors. Um, and then the scene right at the end where he's like they're putting the chocolate hats on everybody,
S'mores,
the
that I mean, that
s'mores,
is hilarious. That
and
is absolutely hilarious.
and they're all sat there just really resigned to it, like, yep, this is what we
Yeah.
deserve. And
Mm,
it's like they kind of like they get him now and they're on
yeah.
board with the
Yeah.
menu. And I was laughing, so it's horrific,
There's
but
a
I
culty
laugh.
quality to it. I mean, you are right. There is almost like a very subtle folk horror quality to it in the sense that it's dealing with very similar themes to things like The Wicker Man and Midsummer, where people buy into particular like culture prescribed cultures
Mhm.
ultimately, and
Yeah.
they go with them. They allow those prescribed cultures to invade them and overtake things like their reason and their common sense and their ability to analyze. So they just surrender at the end. And of course, I mean, there's the burning element too. There is a ritual element to that.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is quite ritual. And then it just cuts to her eating a cheeseburger.
Oh, I loved
Oh,
that. I mean, at the end of the film, I really wanted a cheeseburger, you know? I
oh,
really
it
wanted a
looks so good.
cheeseburger.
It doesn't it look really good?
It actually they deliberately, I mean, very clearly, they deliberately wanted that cheeseburger to look like heaven, you know?
The
They
best
wanted it to
cheeseburger.
be like, "Oh, everybody needs to rush out of this film and go and get a cheeseburger because that is it, right?"
Yeah.
But no, it was really interesting. I really enjoyed that film. And again, it's I mean, it's interesting that again it would be allowed past the gates because it has all the elements of being a kind of, slightly comedic take on these matters, not exactly elevated by, in those terms.
Yeah. It's kind of on the
And
edge.
yet, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't again, it's a really I don't think I would ever use the term. I don't think I would ever in the same way I would never use the term like literary, because it
Yeah.
doesn't actually mean anything to me. I always look at stuff that things like Hellraiser, for example, the original Hellraiser, which is a really smart film. It's an
Yeah.
incredibly smart film with all manner of resonances and cultural cues and things that would never been seen before, but it's also blood and guts, pain, sadism, bodily mutilation, etc., etc. It's
Hmm.
all the aesthetic stuff. I mean, people describe. I've heard it described as Ibsen with monsters, and that's exactly what it is. It's a film that's about. There's almost like a social satire element going on about the nature of family, right? The
Hmm.
family politics in that film is really interesting. So you have Larry, who's the very dull sort of like patriarch of a family,
Hmm.
who's completely unaware of what's going on with the women in his life. He's totally unaware of his wife Julia's unhappiness. He's totally unaware of the things that are going on underneath the surface because he just wants her to be the pretty housefrau. And that's
Hmm.
it. He wants her to be smiling. He wants her to be sexy. And that's it. He doesn't want anything else from her. Doesn't understand anything about her internal life. You've got the stuff like the almost like fairy tale wicked stepmother and put upon daughter element going on between her and his daughter,
Hmm.
Kirsty. And that dynamic is almost funny. It's almost like French farce, or like it's like Abigail's Party or something like that. You know, it's like a play for
Oh,
today.
Abigail's Party, I forgot all about
Right,
that.
right. It is that, but then thrown into it, you have this whole dimension with the what? With the Cenobites, with Uncle Frank up in the spare room, um, and the imagery of the Cenobites, that sort of like sadomasochistic people imagery that they have going on, which nobody had seen before
Mhm.
Hellraiser came out, which was totally out of Clive Barker's imagination. Now, aesthetically alone, that film wouldn't be allowed through the gates. It would not be considered, quote unquote, elevated horror.
Yeah.
And yet, it's really smart. It's really insightful. It has all of these ironic and satirical points to make about the nature of family. It's really transgressive. It introduces queer and BDSM imagery, which horror fans would never have seen before unless they operated in certain
Certain fun
demographics.
circles.
Right, absolutely. Absolutely. It's a
Yeah.
really it's just something I don't buy into. It's certainly something I don't buy into when I sit down to not only when I sit down to read, but when I sit down to write, you know.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're the same. I don't honestly don't sit down and think, "Oh, I'm gonna write this type of story."
Oh no, it just kind of ends up being a thing.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, I wanted to ask you if you've got any thoughts. So there's like a whole bunch of stuff in this category of films. There's a question at the end of this. So like,
mm,
for anyone that wants more examples, things like Black Swan,
yeah,
Antichrist, Pan's Labyrinth, I'd say
yeah,
these are the Suspiria. These are all elevated horror
Suspiria,
films.
yeah.
But I have noticed for the more recent ones, thematically, a lot of these are like horror kind of deals with death. That's just kind of a blanket theme, I would
Yeah,
say.
yeah.
But these films, a lot of them deal with either Satanism,
Mhm.
um, sort of like the darker arts, like dark
Yeah.
witchcraft, things like that. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on
Well,
culturally what's going on there, do you
Well, it's
think?
really complex. I think it's really complex, especially if those films are American. It's really complex because, of course, you had in the USA has a slightly different cultural context in this regard. In the
The
1980s, they had the
religion. Mhm.
Satanic Panic. They had
Yes.
the
Yeah.
Satanic Panic, you know, which was, I mean, that is one of the most fascinating cultural phenomena I have ever seen. Honestly, guys, go to YouTube and type in the Satanic Panic and watch one of the documentaries about it. It was a period in the 1980s when and it seems to have been made entirely out of whole cloth. It sprung out of almost nothing.
Yeah.
The USA descended into this state of absolute paranoia regarding entirely non-existent circles of satanic cultism, which was apparently operating in schools, in like nurseries, in circles of government. None of it was real.
Hmm.
None of it was real. Like none of it. Absolutely nothing. But it became so profound, it changed law. It actually changed law. So there was a point in the 1980s when, as a result of the Satanic Panic, police officers were being trained in how to recognize apparent satanic imagery if they attended like a crime scene or a murder scene or something
Wow.
like that. Right, right. Teachers. There are teachers who lost their jobs because of it. There are people who were arrested and were put in jail and were not released until very recently because of the Satanic Panic, because they were
Wow.
accused of, right, right. It is mental. And it tells you so much about cultural paranoia and about how certain kinds of historical trauma build up. And because I would argue the Satanic Panic is an expression of stuff like cultural trauma that's been happening arguably since the 1960s. So it's stuff like Vietnam. It's stuff like, as we were discussing earlier, it's that generational divide that happened between the children of the 1960s and their parents from the 1950s and 40s. It's the volte face that happened culturally in the 1970s when all of these counterculture revolutions failed, and those who were parts of them found themselves without anything to latch onto. Suddenly, you have this vacuum, you have this ideological void, and what fills it? Paranoia. stories, conspiracy theories, when there's nowhere else to go. Yeah. Also, in the 1980s, you have the advent, you have the Reagan project, the Reagan and Thatcher project, just running roughshod across culture and society. So you have neoliberalism destroying culture and society. You have businesses running roughshod, being able to do anything they like to their workers, pollution running rampant, etc., or the public services being defunded and destroyed, etc., etc., the cult of the individual rising. What the Satanic Panic really expressed is something really deep and profound, which people just didn't have the language for. And sadly, they got their language prescribed to them by reactionaries, by the right-wing evangelical movement, which was then on the rise. Yeah. So suddenly, even normal people, like just everyday people, were afraid of completely innocuous things like kids' cartoons and Dungeons and Dragons, all of which were accused of being satanic, by the way.
Yeah.
It was crazy. So when films, particularly American horror films, are dealing with things like Satanism and occultism now, it's normally not a Satanism and occultism. It's a shorthand for something else. It's a shorthand for that particular cultural paranoia. It's
Yeah.
not often about Satanism in and of itself per se, because as has been demonstrated, there's really nothing to be afraid of there.
Yeah, I've noticed so basically all of the work I've seen by Osgood Perkins so far is using those themes. So the Black Coat's Daughter, which is also called February, I love that film. No one seems to have seen it. I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House isn't satanic, but there's something fucky going on there, George.
Yeah,
And
yeah. It's like
also, yeah, what was the most recently, Long Legs.
oh, loved it.
Yeah,
Loved it.
I feel like that Osgood Perkins, Ari Aster, and Robert Eggers are kind of like the elevated horror trifecta at the moment.
I suppose so. I mean, like Longlegs is a very particular show because, of course, Longlegs is everything I just described. It's a
Yeah,
roadmap of. It's a roadmap of it. Longlegs. I mean, and we talked earlier about how having particular contexts, to coin the phrase, elevates your enjoyment of particular films or media. That's, I think, the case for Longlegs. I think if you take it completely literally and just see it as this very literal story of a satanic serial killer, blah blah blah, it's an enjoyable film, but it's only an enjoyable film. If you
yeah,
understand the context that it's going for, the reason it even includes satanic imagery, for example, is because this film is so powerfully aware of the cultural paranoias that were happening in the US in the 1970s and
yeah,
how those paranoias were expressed through cinema. So in Longlegs, you've just got all of this stuff, all of this cultural stuff that's it's just thrown into a cooking pot, and blended together. It's wonderful. So you've got like elements of Zodiac, elements of serial killer mythology, elements of that paedophobia, that fear of children and of young people that we were discussing earlier. You've got the Satanic Panic in really like massively,
yeah.
massively the paranoia of the Satanic Panic. You even have things like, I mean, Nick Cage's character, Longlegs, one of the best Nick Cage performances you'll ever see.
Yeah,
Absolutely brilliant. But embodied in that character is so many sort of cultural paranoias. I mean, one of the things is a really strange element of cinema that happened in the 1970s. And it was part of that whole exploitation thing, but also the demonization of the other that happened throughout the 1970s. You
yeah,
had this problem, this thing with like the trans serial killer that is in
yeah.
so many 1970s films and horror films. It's a real trope. It's a real trope, right? And in Longlegs, you've kind of got that embodied and explored. I mean, if it were just literal, if Longlegs were just another in the long line of trans serial killers in horror films, then I probably would have found it objectionable. But it's not that.
It's so like I think the whether or not people enjoy long legs again, I think it comes back to this context thing because I recommended it to my mum yesterday because I bought it on Amazon Prime, and
Uh,
she was here watching things, and we generally have the same taste in films, my mum and I.
right.
But I have to clarify for anyone that's not very familiar with me, right? I don't have a religion, and in fact,
Uh,
I'd consider myself an atheist. I don't believe in
uh,
anything supernatural at all, or gods, the devil, anything. But I am a very big fan of Satan and Baphomet because I'm a horror fan, and it's my favorite. Satan tends to just be my favorite horror theme or character, and I love Baphomet. I love his little goatee hoofs, and I have people, my family members like buy them for me as Christmas presents. I've got lots of little Baphomet things around my house. So, but to me, Baphomet is purely, it's a fictional um, symbol of my favorite sort of horror subgenres.
yeah.
But because of my vested interest in sort of like religious horror fiction, my background knowledge of like real life satanic crimes, shall we say, and things like the
Uh,
satanic panic and things, I think I know a little bit more than a lot of people in my age bracket for
uh,
historically, because I've looked all this up and it's just a hobby. It's just a hobby
it's
of
so, I mean,
mine.
it is just so fascinating, isn't it? Because there's
Yeah,
no bottom of the barrel. The more you
yeah,
find, the weirder it gets. And I don't mean weird in the sense of like, oh, there's this weird occult stuff. No, no, no. It's weird in terms of just how deep the paranoia went and how you
yeah.
had perfectly innocent people having to explain themselves in court over things they never did.
Yeah, and it's yeah, it's just it's not in line with reality a lot of the time, and
Oh,
but I really enjoyed Long Legs. I did have like one little issue, which was I felt like there was a bit of an exposition dump when the rest
yes.
of the film had built itself so nicely. I was like,
Yeah,
could you show us
I
that a
could
bit
have.
better? But
I think the only thing that it could have done was be a bit less literal about it. I didn't
yeah,
need the explanation. I
no,
think it would have
no,
actually been stronger without it, and if it
yeah,
were all just imagery. Because up
yeah.
to that point, the film kind of was that, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. I was trusting it that it was just gonna like let me piece it all together, and then it
Yeah.
was like, oh, I'm gonna give you a
Oh no,
monologue now.
actually, yeah,
I was like,
this is
ah.
happening, and yeah,
But
and
I,
it's like, okay, fine, it's I
yeah,
I get it, but on the whole, I thought it was really smart and really interesting and really fun and very aware of what it wanted to do. And
yeah.
again, it's the kind of film probably wouldn't necessarily be let through the gates of what's called elevated horror because of the way it deliberately evokes the sort of schlocky horror of the 1970s.
It's a weird one, and like I recommend. I really enjoyed it for the most part. I only had that one
Mm,
gripe about it, really, but
likewise.
and it did build, and it did get more. It starts with a bang, literally, and
Mm-hmm.
um and it yeah it gets like scarier towards the end and everything, and
Nick
then
Cage, what did they do? Did they just say, Nick, just do what you like?
just do your best Nick
Just
Caging, and
do,
he just
yeah,
was perfect for this role. But my
do whatever you want. I mean, sing your lines, which he does a couple of times.
Yeah. But my mum didn't enjoy it very much, and she said,
Right.
"I don't know what it is." She went, "I know that this is good,
Yeah.
but for whatever reason, I'm just not connecting with it." And I thought maybe it's
Ah,
just because you're not obsessed with Satan like I am. I don't know, like
yeah,
it's just
and I
taste,
get
isn't
that
it?
too, by the way. I
Yeah,
mean, a lot of, these really some of the more arch horror films, things like Midsummer, like Longlegs, the more arch ones that do kind of require you to have a little bit of context in order to get the most out of. I can
yeah.
understand how they can be alienating, or if you don't have the context, you can just not get anything out of them. I totally understand that.
Yeah, it would be like if somebody made something about Roswell now for a young audience that doesn't have
Mhm.
the historical or political
Right.
context.
So
It,
if you weren't like a teenager in the 1990s when the X-Files were out and stuff like that,
yeah,
when that like it was when that kind of thing was just the dogs, right? It was everywhere. Everyone loved it. It was like the unexplained documentaries and the everywhere you turned, there were magazines and interviews with like people who've been purportedly kidnapped by aliens and stuff like that, right?
yeah. It's a gosh, it's so yeah. I don't know. Ever
How do you
since you said
explain
about
that? how do you
Sorry.
explain? I mean, obviously, you know, how do you explain that to people who were not born at the time? It
Well,
was so interesting to be alive in that period, right?
yeah, I feel the same about trying to explain to people why the Blair Witch Project was so frightening when it came
Oh,
out.
yes,
Because people just do not get it. And I was like, you had to be
yeah,
there to understand that
definitely.
people
Like,
had only just got the internet. It was the first
right,
viral marketing campaign for
yes.
film.
And it's trying to explain to people that the way they marketed this, people thought it was real.
Yeah,
For the
and
longest time, people thought there was real footage in this thing and that, like, the filmmakers really did go missing and all this stuff.
yeah, and try and when people are, well, how could they think it's real? Didn't anyone see them? Like, you have to understand that we were only just in the internet age. We did
Yes.
that. MySpace existed, but no other
Mm,
social media did.
right,
You couldn't just, like, there was no one had the internet or a camera on their phone yet.
right.
So it's not like if any of these people were spotted at a hotel, someone would just take a picture of them and let
Yeah.
everybody know. It was way
We were
easier to keep
just
secrets.
That's right. We were just not as connected back then. We were just not as connected. So things slipped by.
Yeah.
Things just slipped through the net, you know.
And they did a
Um,
big campaign on the run up, didn't they? They made a website that looked
they
old,
made a
like that.
they made a
Well, I say old.
website.
Yeah,
They put about all sorts of stuff about the missing students. They made whole lives for them. They did
yeah,
things like there was a documentary on the Sci-Fi Channel called the Blair Witch something, which it was like a real documentary. It was brilliant. It was they
yeah,
talked to people who claimed to be like from the Burkittsville Historical Society, from the filmmakers' families, and it was presented. I mean, you mentioned like the Roswell stuff, the 1990s unexplained stuff.
yeah,
It was presented like those documentaries.
yeah.
So into that slew of credulity where people were on the edge about things like, oh, maybe people are seeing ghosts or getting kidnapped by aliens. You have this, right?
Yeah, so like
Which,
they brought all of this stuff out before releasing the film. So
yeah.
when the film came out and like the little title thing comes up like, oh, this footage was found.
Mm,
People like found footage, like it wasn't the first ever example of found
no,
footage, but
it was
it's definitely the one that um catapulted it as a
definitely.
genre, I would
Yeah.
say.
It is the one that made it completely mainstream. I mean, the other two examples I can think of from previous eras was the 1992 Halloween prank Ghost Watch,
Oh
uh,
yeah,
which
yeah,
was fabulous. I mean that is so good. It's
yeah.
so good. And there was this very obscure film that sadly came out just around the same time as the Blair Witch Project, but didn't have the marketing, called The Last Broadcast.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Uh,
I've seen that.
it's not as good. It's not as good because it does make the mistake at the end of giving you an absolute explanation, and that's always death
Yeah,
for these kinds of films. And it does kill it. But it's not bad, you know. The vast majority of it isn't bad. It expresses some very similar themes to the Blair Witch Project. You know how the Blair Witch Project is about it's about lots of things, but one of the things it absolutely expresses is our paranoia about escalating technology. So the camera becomes a source of horror in the Blair Witch Project. That limited view, the motion of the camera, where you're not
yeah,
certain about what you're seeing or what's going on, and you trick yourself into thinking you've seen things that you haven't. That's
yeah.
kind of what the last broadcast is about too. It's
Yeah,
really clever. I mean, it is. It's worth watching the last broadcast. Like I say, the last like maybe 3 minutes, it kills itself, unfortunately. But up to
yeah,
that point, it's actually really good and worth your time because it's a good sort of historical artifact. It tells you like how these kinds of documentary found footage horrors have evolved over time and where
yeah.
they came from.
I think the one I think of that a lot of people don't talk about, I think it came out around the same time as Psycho, so I think it was Eclipse, but it was Peeping Tom.
Peeping Tom, yeah. Well, Peeping Tom was banned. That's
Oh, it
another
was
thing.
banned.
Peeping Tom had a real, yeah. The reaction against Peeping Tom was strong because, of course, you not only had the murder element with that one, you had also kind of like the voyeuristic sexual element, and that
Yeah,
really drove like the moral lot. It drove them right over the edge. Right, and to be fair to them, it is it is kind of a nasty exploitative film in many. I mean, and it does it. The thing that Peeping Tom does that's really bloody clever is it places because the murder weapon is the camera. The camera has this big bloody spike on it, which is what's killing the girls. Yeah. So
Yeah.
you are seeing the girls in states of like eroticized poses, but they're also being harassed and murdered at the same time
Yes.
through the eye of the killer. It places you in that role. It makes it begs the question about your voyeurism and your desire to see violence against women. It's actually really kind of again, it's really kind of clever in that
Yeah.
regard, you know?
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Not like hee, but I appreciate the filmmaking was great.
Yeah,
It was effective as a horror film for me, for sure.
yeah.
Um,
Definitely. It's a nasty film. I mean, it is a nasty, exploitative, grubby ass film, that one.
yeah, it is grubby. Do you have
Mm.
I'll have to let you go soon, George, which makes me sad. Um, do
Well,
you have um any favorites in this genre that you'd recommend to people?
it's a weird thing again because I don't buy into the term. It's a bit difficult to be honest. I mean,
Yeah.
I I I like. I mean, the films and the media that I like profoundly and unabashedly, and I will always find resonance in them, whether they're part of any particular like subgenre or not. I have a real, it's something I notice more. I mean, I sound like a bloody old man, but it is something I notice quite a lot at the moment in like sort of online horror culture where you have these like categorizations and then subcategorizations and then
Mhm.
subcategorizations of the subcategorizations.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't really buy into that. I'll be honest. I don't buy into it. I don't because I find the definition to be shaky anyway. At what
Hmm.
point does this horror stop being horror and become science fiction? Well, it doesn't. Frankenstein. At what point does Frankenstein stop being horror and become science fiction? The answer is it doesn't. It's both and or neither. You know, it's its own entity.
I
War of the
have
Worlds. At what point does that stop being horror and become science fiction or vice versa? Kind of doesn't. It's its own thing, you know?
that's how I used to weed out people on Tinder back in the day when I was on there. When
Mhm.
people would ask me what my favorite horror film was, and I'd
Yeah.
say Alien or Aliens, and I'd
Mhm.
wait for the dickhead that would go, "Well, actually, that's
Actually,
fiction."
that's science fiction,
And
isn't
I'd
it?
go,
Oh,
I'm not going to justify or try to
it
sort of like
doesn't
qualify my favorite horror
matter.
film with you. Um,
Right. And it
yeah,
doesn't matter. That's the other thing.
no,
I can't, I find it very difficult to invest in these labels and these divisions, you know, because they seem synthetic to me. They taste synthetic in my mouth and my mind. So I find that very hard. I mean, I can tell you the films that I think are really smart and that make me think and really impress me over and over again. And we mentioned a
yes,
couple of them, things
go.
like Midsummer. Midsummer I thought was beautiful and clever and resonant. The Witch I thought was fantastic. But more recently, Longlegs, fantastic, beautiful. The Wicker Man, the original Wicker Man, I think is
Yeah,
one of the smartest horror films ever made. Alien. You mentioned Alien, really
yeah,
smart, beautiful. The original Halloween, which so many people condemn as a slash, is just like a slasher film. People misinterpret that film profoundly. It's a
mhm.
supernatural horror film.
Oh
It's a
yeah.
supernatural horror film. It's about the essence of Halloween. It's about the spirit of Halloween. And it's also about, again, it's about patriarchy and violence against women and all sorts of really
And
clever stuff.
family.
Family, right, right.
Yeah.
Things like oh, The Thing.
Oh,
Thing
I love the
is
thing.
just so bloody clever. It's such an amazingly resonant, brilliant horror film that tells you so much about what people were afraid of in the 1980s. What was the paranoia in the
Yeah,
1980s? You know, that
great
film
film.
tells you so much about that. In terms of video games, we mentioned Silent Hill 2. Yes, very much so. There's a recent series of independent video games called Fear and Hunger,
Hmm.
just fantastic. I mean, so smart, so incredibly smart. Um, there's so many. I find it difficult because there's just so much that I find to be compelling and interesting and expressive of so much that's going on. I mean, if we look into like where we operate, you know, the independent horror sphere,
Hmm.
I find that almost difficult to pass because there's so much good stuff.
Oh yeah, yeah.
You know,
It's
there's just so much.
Oh, I forgot to tell you this earlier, George, just because we mentioned Alien.
Mhm.
The film that beat me on my Challenge Kaylee run, where I sincerely hated this film so much, and it's Justin Park's fault because he suggested this to me, was
Ah,
Alien Covenant.
oh, well done, Justin. Yeah,
I
yeah,
I hate it too because he knows how much I love Alien and Aliens and how I care a little bit too
yeah.
much.
It
Um,
sucks, doesn't it?
oh,
Alien
thank you.
Covenant fucking sucks. It is. I mean, I hate Prometheus too, by the way. But you
Me
know what?
too.
Prometheus isn't boring. I'll give it that. It's a
Yeah.
bad film on so many levels. It's bad. But you know what? I can remember Prometheus. I remember the beats of Prometheus. Covenant. Every time I come to watch it, I give it a few months after, and I've forgotten it. I've
I
forgotten everything
I
about it.
I I hated it an unreasonable amount, I think. Like people are always like, you take these things too seriously. And like, well, I care about
Yeah,
storytelling first and
yeah.
foremost, and that made me mad. Um,
Covenant is bad. Covenant is really, really, really bad. And also, I mean, like that whole thing. I mean, I hate this so much. I mean, it's a bit of a bête noir of mine when this very postmodern trend in trying to explain things that don't need to be explained.
oh yeah, like
Hate.
the origin of the xenomorph. No one cares.
Oh, and not only does anyone care, but by giving it an origin,
It ruins
you're
it.
killing the resonance. The whole thing, like the horror of the original Alien, isn't just the alien itself. It's not the physical threat that it poses. It's the fact that it's unknown. That's
Yeah,
part of it. That's why it's called Alien, right?
and it's just something that's naturally evolved
Right.
elsewhere. Um,
Right.
and it
It is
opens up.
what it's expressing is Lovecraftian horror. It's cosmic horror, right? It's the fact that the universe is so unknowable, so hostile, so
Yeah,
strange that
and
we
when you
can't
think
possibly
yeah,
do anything about it or operate there, right?
when you think the xenomorph is just a creature that's from somewhere else, it makes you think, well, what else is out there?
What
Because
else is out there,
and
right?
then
And
they're
not
like,
only
oh,
that, but
well,
like in the original Alien film, you don't even learn that much about the xenomorph, really. I mean, it could
no,
have any number of life cycles after that. It could
yeah,
have any other number of capabilities. It could do things like implant its DNA in people and transform them, or any number of things. The possibilities are endless,
yeah,
you know? So
oh,
to
so
just
good.
to codify and to explain and to give it an origin is like, no, you are missing the point.
I'm thinking I'm gonna have to have you back to just talk about the Alien franchise now, George.
Well, I'd love to do that. I'd love to. I
Yeah,
mean, I did that with my friend Gerard recently over on Exaggerated Elegy because we hated Prometheus so much that we were like, we were going to have to explain the context of this, why we reacted so violently to it. So we're going to have to do all the others. We've got to
yeah,
get to so people understand, right?
yes,
Um,
yeah, exactly.
so we did, but I would happily do it again. I will talk about those films all day, any day, endlessly. Because like Alien is actually, if you had to put a gun to my head and say which one, like
Mhm.
which of these films is the most important, which is the one that speaks to you the most profoundly. Don't think about it. Just say the first thing that comes into your head. It would probably be Alien.
Yeah, for me too. I think I kind of enjoy Alien and Aliens
Uh,
equally, but I guess if I had to pick, it's Alien for me.
Alien, yeah. I mean, my
Um,
favorite of the franchise is Alien and Alien 3, actually. And I know that's not popular, but I really love Alien 3. I think it does some
it was doing
fun.
something.
Right, it was
It
trying, right? It
it
was
wa-
trying
it
to
had
do something
style.
different, Yeah, definitely.
Fo- Following on from the example of the first two, where the first one is a that's a straight up balls out horror film, and then the
Yep.
second one they throw a bit more action horror into it, and then this one's got a different style again, and it was
Flavor, different theme, like introducing
yeah,
metaphysics into the Alien universe. And I loved that. I thought that was really ambitious, really clever. And
it's
it
yeah,
is a much better film than it's given credit for. And given what was happening behind the scenes, it's a miracle it exists at all, quite frankly.
yes,
You know,
agreed. So
complete miracle.
yes, yeah, no, it's not my favorite, but I completely respect it and appreciate that a lot of artistry and thought went into it. It's
Mm.
just it wasn't my particular cup of tea, but I would never
Yeah.
say it's a terrible film.
No,
Um,
I can totally get it because it is a very it's not its appeal is not as universal as the previous two films. It is a
yeah,
very niche, very weird and interesting film. I mean, for me, it's my kind of I like that. You know, I like that strange, ambiguous, weird. Well, you've read some of my stuff, you know.
yes, yes. It's
Yeah,
very you, George.
it's very
I'm so sad to have to wrap this up, but thank you so much for
it's
doing
all
this. I always love talking to you.
likewise. It's always, always, always a pleasure. And you know, if you'll have me back on, I'd love to come back on.
Oh, at any time, George. I'll probably message you immediately now, some other ideas. Um,
Brilliant. I'm up
so
for it always.
so circling background for everyone listening. So I will put all of George's information so you can dox him in the well, his social information in the
No, it's not going
description.
to make any difference because I'm such an idiot. Most of my information's out there anyway, so I don't give a shit. You know, it's like whatever. You know, it's fine.
I'll put links to George's work, YouTube, and everything, and especially the Silent Hill 2 remake
Honestly,
playthrough.
guys, I mean, I haven't finished it yet, but if you do want to hear me scream and swear a lot,
It's
basically,
it's honestly, George, it is my favorite Let's Play of all time.
oh,
It's
that's really kind. Thank you so much. But yeah,
a
you know
quick.
what I think? You know what I think? It's just it's so sincere because I am so when I'm playing that blood, I can only play it for like periods of at most an hour because it
Yeah,
does it
theory.
getting to me. It's
Yeah.
actually getting to me at this point, and it's like bloody hell. I mean, obviously I'm going to finish it. Obviously I'm going to finish it, but bloody hell, I might not play after I've done it. I might not play it again for a while.
Well, it's very disturbing. But I think the thing that puts your playthrough in my favorite over other people's playthroughs is that you've got the actual playthrough of the game, obviously. So if you're looking for the gameplay, you've got that in there, and then there's just this wonderful mix of you sort of explaining what you're seeing, and because you have a lot of knowledge of like the context, the original games,
Uh,
and other things as well. Like you go from, oh, and is that painting? Oh, that's reminiscent of H.R. Geiger. And then 2 seconds later, you're screaming. You're like, fuck
yeah,
off, fuck off.
screaming and swearing. Yeah,
And
yeah.
that is
That's
that that's mixed with um every video. At least once you go, I've got a nice cup of tea, by the way. It gets
yeah.
me
I
every.
know. I've done that. I put that in as a theme now. It
It's a
happens.
it's a thing now, and
Yeah,
also
it's a thing.
my I started posting them on Facebook, but then I thought if I post something and it like so out of context, George quotes is my new favorite thing because you come up with something that I always laugh if I think like in the moment it makes perfect sense, but if anyone just heard you say that and nothing else,
Yes.
it's yeah, so it's really entertaining and informative and just interesting because you talk a lot of other horror related things in there as well. So it's like a horror fan's dream
Thank
basically,
you. Oh, thank you. I
that
mean,
playthrough.
Silent Hill is perfect fodder for that, of course, because it is made of its horror references, right? I mean, like
Yeah.
you know, the original map for Silent Hill 1, I think, all the street names in Silent Hill are named after horror writers, all of them.
Yeah, it's so much. I think the fact that you've got so much knowledge of like the context of those references though that makes it a lot more fun because I catch a lot of
Yeah.
it, but there's a lot that I missed as well. So I'm like, oh yeah. So
Course,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, even when you're playing it, you're going to miss stuff because, of course, you're running away from Pyramid Head, or you're sort of like, you know, getting really scared and not wanting to be there.
Yeah, it's yeah, it's really yeah, I've really been enjoying those. There's a lot to go on with, guys, and George hasn't finished it yet, but
I haven't yet. No, I'm
a
getting
lot of
there though.
parts.
I'm just about in the final chapter now, so we're in the home stretch now.
So excited.
Gonna miss it. Gonna miss it when it's gone. But bloody hell, it's doing a number on my nerves. I can tell you.
You'll have to have a nice calm sleep after watching something funny when you've finished it.
Well, I was saying like I think after I've done this, I'm gonna give survival horror a break, you
Yeah.
know, and do something else briefly, something different, maybe something cuter, maybe a Final Fantasy game or something like that, you know,
Yeah.
something lighter, something a bit more, you know, a bit more, something that's not as depressing as Silent Bloody Hill.
Yeah, there's definitely a tone for that.
Yeah, isn't there? Isn't there just? I mean, it's brilliant. I cannot emphasize enough, guys, like how good Silent Hill 2, the remake is. It's astounding. It's for me, it's game of the year. It has to be.
Oh, I'm so excited. My brother and I do game stuff. We haven't done any for a while, and he usually plays because I cannot talk and play at the same time. But
Right, right.
we are going to go into Silent Hill 2 remake in January, and I'm the one playing it, so I'm very scared. But, but I have braced myself with your videos, so
So you
hopefully I'll be
should,
all right.
yeah. I mean, I'm not the best game player, guys. Anyone who's seen my Bloodborne and Dark Souls Let's Plays will tell you I am not the best video game player out there. But
Me
I
neither.
try. I'm very enthusiastic. I give it a good go.
Well, I think you've been doing just fine, George.
Well, I panic. That's what I do. I panic and just start firing and swinging wildly and swearing and see if that gets me through.
Very relatable. All right, so yes, we will call it there. We'll do our usual sign off of Bleat. All the information will be in the description, and I'll get George back for you all as soon as I can.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much, Kaylee.
Yeah, thanks again, George.
My
Bleat.
pleasure. Bleat.